As ever, I only got to go near a computer and it stops working. Good, right. So, what am I going to talk about this year? A bit about serial numbers, a fascinating subject, but I'll try to make it a bit more generic than that. As ever, a few things that you may have missed. And I love calling them things you may have missed. It implies that you've not read them in the documentation. You've not read the release notes properly. What it possibly is that the documentation team never knew about the features, or indeed, I only found about them because I happened to be listening when some people were talking in the office, and I'm thinking, might want to mention that. And at the end, a request for comment. Don't want an immediate response, but something for you to think about. So, serial numbers. As we said, we're changing the way we license Dyalog APL, the way we make it available. And the idea is that we allow for unregistered versions on all platforms, simplified downloads, easier for people to get hold of Dyalog APL for multiple platforms. One of the main reasons we started was to allow easier deployment of Docker images in commercial production, and quite frankly, it makes our lives easier. Currently we have, we'll have a beta installer for Windows, and we'll have a commercial installer and a non-commercial installer. What we're trying to do now is get to the point where there's exactly one and one only installation image, and depending on your serial number, that'll display what the usage is that you have. You are still responsible for making sure you have the right license with us, but the serial number will at least show you what you think you have, and means that particularly for the commercial users, that any end users that see the system won't see words like unregistered, providing you use the right serial number. It's not exactly a omnidirectional clicker, this thing, is it? The reason I'm using this is because I had a clicker when I started going through security at Gatwick Airport on Sunday, and I didn't have a clicker by the time I came out the other end of security, and I reckon it's still in the box I left it in. So, serial numbers by platform. I'm going to talk about Windows, and I'll talk about Linux and Mac and Pi. After all, Pi is just Linux on a different hardware chip, and Docker containers and sudo. You'll notice that AIX doesn't appear in that list, and that's because AIX, Dyalog APL for AIX, is considered to be a server version. I do not believe that in history we've ever had someone who wants a non-commercial or personal license for AIX. There are some individuals who do have their own AIX machines at home, but they fell off the back of a lorry or out that didn't quite get into the skip or something like that, so they again don't count. So, serial numbers. What is it? Well, it's a configuration parameter, so what we usually call things on Windows, or an environment variable. It's just like any other one, so that's the end of my presentation. Strictly speaking, it affects the startup banner only. There is no functional difference between a unregistered, registered, or commercial edition version of Dyalog APL for each platform with edition version. As I said before, you do have to have the right license for the usage you have of Dyalog APL. And if you don't set the serial number, then the interpreter will default to assuming you have an unregistered version. In 17.1, we've called it Dyalog_serial. For those of you who have used Windows versions in the past, we use the configuration parameter as merely called serial. Well, since we're now doing it on all platforms, possibly creating an environment variable called serial may potentially conflict with umpteen other applications, so we thought let's have it a bit more specific than that. So, here is a version of Dyalog APL for Windows. I haven't got a serial number, it says it's unregistered. It's also got a bit of spiel about Dyalog is free for non-commercial use, but is not free software. That is a Unicode version of Dyalog APL. I know that because I've set my caption to have a U in it to say Unicode. Here is a Linux registered but not for non-commercial use version of Dyalog APL. So it has a serial number, it says not for commercial use, it has the same spiel in the banner. It's a classic interpreter. It tells you it's a classic interpreter. Here is the equivalent with a commercial license for Unicode. and it doesn't tell you it's Unicode. We have spent years trying to chiv you along to move on to Unicode, please. Okay? And what we've decided is the vast majority of people now use Unicode editions of Dyalog APL, so let's not bother telling you it's Unicode. For the Hangouts, it's classic. We haven't actually done the same for 64 and 32, but that's another story. That's the way we work around here. So, on Windows, the serial number is by default a registry entry. It's a configuration parameter. And as Richard mentions, we have an order in which the interpreter tries to find things. So the nearer the definition of a configuration parameter to the interpreter, the more precedence it has. So start with, we look in the registry, then we'll look on as an environment variable, then we'll look on the command line. But for Windows, we would expect the serial number to appear in the registry itself. When you install Dyalog APL as administrator, we put a chunk of entries in HK local machine. HK local machine, Dyalog 17.164 Unicode, something like that. You install as administrator, we put things in HKLM. Then when a user, other than the user who installed Dyalog APL, uses Dyalog APL for the first time on Windows, we copy the entries. The interpreter copies the entries to their own HK current user. And if you do a non-admin install, we only put things in your own HK current user area of the registry. So here we have HK local machine, Dyalog APL 6417 Unicode, and some of the values that we set in there. On my laptop, here is HK current user for Andy's, and it'll have exactly the same values when we install. So, it's a good idea to put the serial number in when you install on Windows. If you already have a version of Windows installed, we will try and pick up the serial number for what version, from one of the versions you had. It occurred to JD and myself about 4 weeks ago, a couple of weeks before releases, that actually searching in the order of 12.1, 13.0, 13.1, 32, 14.0, 41, 15, 16, 17, starting with 32 Classic, going to 32 Unicode, 64 Classic, 64 Unicode, was a pretty dumb order, because the chances are you've got the more recent ones on there. So we reverse the order, so we start at 17.0, 64 Unicode, and go backwards until we run out of versions where we know there's going to be a serial number. There's a certain amount of, duh, why didn't we think of that years ago? But these are the way it goes. And because I discussed it with John, I've told you a lot about it, whereas if I hadn't discussed it with John, we'd have never found this out, probably. So, we populate the serial number field when you install Dyalog APL. You can type your own one in there. You can delete it if you want. And then, if you've done an admin install, the serial number will be there for all subsequent users. If you don't put the serial number when you install Dyalog APL on Windows, you want to run this function, quadse.dialog.serial, which I will explain later. A masterpiece of coding by Adam over there. So if you don't like it, his fault. If you like it, I asked for it. Basically, it either shows you what the current value is or allows you to set a new value. On Linux and Mac OS, it's just another environment variable. So you could define it in your APL startup script, because what we ask, we'll come to that in a minute, don't fiddle with the MAPL script we supply. Define your own startup script that calls MAPL, because all the environment variables have default values in our script, but if you override one of them, then we use your value, not ours. You could put it in your .profile or your bash profile or whatever else weird shell you choose to use. Put it in etc profile so it's effective for every single user on the system, and certainly AIX and I think one or two others may use etc environment to allow you to set these things. So that's what you do probably for the APL startup scripts in your own profile files. You do that. etc profile, etc profile or etc environment, that's going to be your systems administrator. Or, of course, you can use the masterpiece of function written by Adam, quadse.dialog.serial, which we'll explain later. Or, once you've run Dyalog APL once, you'll find we have created a directory called $home.dialog, and basically you type echo serial number greater than serial, so you don't have to use the masterpiece of APL programming. because on Unix we love to make things as easy as possible, i.e. we allow you to do anything in any fashion you like, you can put the serial number somewhere else if you want to, and define the environment variable Dyalog serial to point to it. Don't let it be said we don't give you the options. Right, this slide, if my screen goes dark or you can't hear me anymore, Jason's having a minor fit in the background, as he's going to disagree violently with what I've just said. So, when you start a Docker container and you don't specify a serial number in some way, you don't set Dyalog serial, when you start that version of Dyalog APL, it will say unregistered. That may not matter to you when you're just messing about, particularly when you want to put Docker containers into a commercial environment, commercial use, you probably don't want to see the words, effectively, it's for a commercial use. So, what you have to do, we will be putting Docker containers, Docker images up on dockerhub.com. The basic one, in fact, we will have nothing but a version of possibly Ubuntu or Debian, I'm not entirely sure what it is, which has got nothing but Dyalog APL installed in it. There will be a my server Docker container that has the operating system Dyalog APL and my server. And what you do is you type docker space run space IT, because you probably want it interactive, -e, and then Dyalog underscore serial equals whatever the serial number is, and then I think this is a Dyalog organization, and that is the particular Docker image you want. That is what you run, even if you haven't downloaded anything from dockerhub.com, providing you have Docker configured correctly. So, Windows, it's a registry entry. Unix, it's an environment variable. Docker, you just have to do a bit of fiddling to get the environment variable into the right place. Other things you can do on Unix is you might want to start Dyalog APL under the sudo command. And what that says is run Dyalog APL with administrative privileges. The most likely reason you want to do that is because you are going to use something like my server, and you want to talk to port 80 for your HTTP connections. Many, many years ago, a bunch of very intelligent people decided that a security feature would be that any port from below 1024, you had to have administrative privileges to connect to it. Which means that any port below that, you have to start your process running as administrator. And if you have no mechanism of then lowering your privileges, you're now running your entire web server as root on a Unix box, which isn't a particularly cool idea. So when we realized this was going to be a bit of a problem, Jeff introduced 4001 IBEAM, and that allows you to change your effective user ID from root to a normal user. So you've lost the ability to wipe the operating system out. Wipe your own files out, that's your problem. Wipe the operating systems out, the sysadmin might get a little bit cross with you. So, if you want to set the Dyalog serial when you've called sudo, it's not quite as simple as just typing sudo Dyalog serial equals serial number and then call the APL script, but you have to edit the etsudoers file to have this entry in there. This isn't specific to Dyalog serial. If you wanted to set a default maxwas or something like that, you have to go through the same technique, is that if you want to sudo it, you have to add it to the sudoers file. Took Jason and me a couple of days to find that one, and I was just sitting there wondering why my environment variables weren't getting through to the interpreter. A slight Linux aside here, by the way. When we install on Linux, we create a file called user-bin-dialog. It's a script that merely calls the particular version of APL that you want. Do not edit that file. It is under the control of the Linux alternatives mechanism, subscript, way of doing things. I'm not quite sure what the right word is. And basically, rather than, if you want it to point to a different version, you run this command, sudo update alternatives --config dialog, and then you select which of the versions you want, so that next time you type dialog, you get the version by default that you want. For the life of me, I can't remember what the purpose of the priority is, but you will notice, again, because we're chivvying you along, Classic has lower priority than Unicode. Move along, please, boys and girls. Move along. We know there are some who are never going to get off Classic. We accept that. But please, for the rest of you, move on. Okay. I'm staying out of that discussion. Okay, we are going to have everybody off Classic eventually. I just don't want to define the word eventually. So, everyone's getting heartily fed up with serial numbers. I certainly am. Dyalog serial, use quadse.dialog.serial. Empty argument, it displays what your current serial number is. Dyalog quadse.dialog.serial, put the serial number in either as a numeric value or a string, then it sets it for all future invocations of Dyalog APL. Strictly speaking, it does much the same in a Windows version, but you won't see the new banner until you start the new APLs. It only affects the banner from a technical point of view. You must have the right licensing for the version you're going to use, for the uses you have for it. We released 17.1 to commercial users a couple of weeks before the conference. That wiped some of us out for a few days, as it always does. To allow us to have all non-commercial or registered or unregistered users doing it, we had to make some changes to the download area of the Dyalog website. Jason didn't really want to do that the week before he started preparing for Dyalog 19. And we have to be ready for people saying, I forgot what my serial number is, or can I get this, that, and the other. And Karen and I didn't want to do that a week before Dyalog 19 either. So you will see some changes to the download area of dialog.com in the near future. For commercial users, you can currently download the installation image. So you will always be able to download the installation image from my.dialog.com. Yep. So that's enough of serial numbers. Windows featurettes, things that I'm not sure we necessarily advertise very well. You may have come across them, you may not. So the language bar, this wonderful thing up here. Here's my machine running on, what, 1920 by something, 1280. And I'm running with a 16-point font, and it looks all right, and the language bar is that size. And I then say, well, I'm talking APL, I want to show you guys some stuff. I'll increase the font size to 26. Bigger font, those are the same size. When you have a screen that's more like 4,000 odd pixels by whatever they happen to be, Kai can tell me because I know he runs on something that's about the size of a small cinema screen, that becomes very, very small. And what we've done is we've added an option, if you right-click on the language bar itself, of use the session font. And what that does, you select that, is rather than using a bunch of fixed size icons, we populate the characters using the font size that you currently have in the session. Okay? Sorry? No, so literally, you just right-click on it. Sorry, no, it is the size of the font. So the font size is a preference that's saved. So the session font and the size of the font in the language bar will remain the same. Oh, yeah, well, that will remember that.
The clicker, is that in preferences?
That's just a right-click on the. That's just the context menu of the language bar, okay. And I think we save it in the registry. And if we don't, it will be in a couple of weeks' time. I'm pretty certain we do, don't we, John? Yeah. Right. Again, on Windows, I like Ride. One of the most brilliant things that Nick Nikolov did, I think it was he who came up with it, was the backtick keyboard. So if I want in Ride originally to get a quad, I hit backtick because it's the top left-hand key on a UK keyboard, and L. And if I want the key symbol, it's backtick Shift K. And when he first mentioned it, I thought, this isn't going to work. I don't like the sound of this tool. It works really well. And what we've done is we've introduced it, added it to the IME. So when I say we, I mean John. Has added it to the IME. So you can use that, the backtick keyboard in the IME. I think there's a setting somewhere down in the depths of the configuration options for the IME to do that. What it does mean is it won't work with a classic interpreter because the classic interpreter does not use the IME. On the other hand, you could use Ride locally to the front end of a classic interpreter. But what it also means is that you can use the backtick keyboard in Word and the such like. Again, it's backtick keyboard because it's the top left-hand key on the UK keyboard. You can define the introducer character to be, I think, within reason, whatever you want. locals lines was requested by one of our users. When you write a traditional function, the chances are the longer the function, the longer line 0. It disappears somewhere off into infinity in that direction. And what we have done on request is to allow you to split line 0 into multiple lines where you define local variables, or local names on separate lines. And the rules are that the first non-white space character, i.e. non-space character, must be a semicolon, and the only thing that can appear between line 0 and comment and locals lines are more locals lines, blank lines, or comment lines. We have an option, toggle localization, on a Windows keyboard. That's Control up arrow. And that says if the name I'm hovering over is currently localized, unlocalize it. So that will take it out of whatever locals line it has been defined on. And if I hit toggle local on a name that is not localized, I'm afraid we only ever add it to line 0. So if you decide to unlocalize everything and localize everything again, you've gone from multiple locals lines to a very long line 0 again. And given the fact that in the tracer you can configure it to skip comments, skip blank lines, you can also say skip locals lines as well. We added this in 17.0, but since I didn't give a presentation last year, I'm telling you about it now. If your code uses quad shadow, consider using locals lines. If your code, rather than quad shadow followed by a list of names, does quad shadow each a list of names, just get rid of that. Using local names, using locals lines is more efficient within the interpreter than using multiple calls to quad shadow, and it's much better to use quad shadow on a list of names than it is to use quad shadow on each of a list of names. Effectively, within the interpreter, when you look up for a name, you've got to wander up and down a huge, great, long stack of stuff. And quad shadow will effectively put more blocks on than a locals line, and if you're doing quad shadow each, you get a lot of blocks. Again, the sort of thing that I only found out because I started asking awkward questions of developers. Other things you might have missed in 17.0, we've fiddled with the left argument of quad CY slightly. The good news is that we've extended it so the left argument can now be a vector of character vectors, on the basis that almost everything else that can take a matrix of names or a vector of a single name also allows a vector of character vectors. We've done this with quad CY. We have, however, tightened things up slightly, and that is, in versions before 17, if you type hex space dec quad CY defins, it would copy in hex and do absolutely nothing with dec. And now what we do is we issue a domain error. So one of the rows of the matrix defining the left argument of quad CY or a simple character vector can only have one name in it. It can have leading spaces, it can have trailing spaces, but it can't have two or more names in it. The other thing, I really like 2000 IBeam. I think I've spoken about it. The words you might want to use are witter on about or bore me to death about 2000 IBeam over the last few versions of Dyalog conferences, user meetings. We've added 2000 IBeam 19. 2000 IBeam 0 tells you the number of compactions since the beginning of the process or since you last called 2000. And that's all very well. You say, blimey, I've got 50 compactions. I must have max was wrong. That's all very well, but it could be that you've got 49 calls on quad WA, each of which forces a compaction. So what we've done is added an option to say, tell me the number of times quad WA has been called. So now, look at 2000 IBeam 2. If that's high, look at 2000 IBeam 19. If that's high, you should be thinking, why have I got all those calls to quad WA in my code? It's a very, very heavy call, because you're going to squeeze all the arrays where possible. You're going to shuffle all the information up to the beginning of the workspace. That means all the pointers have to change, and then we free up some memory. So it's a very heavy operation, and you want to minimize the number of calls to quad WA. There may be reasons why you need them, but avoid it. So 2000 IBEAM 19 tells you the number of times your code is called quad WA, and the difference between 2000 IBEAM 19 and 2000 IBEAM 2 tells you how many times the interpreter has run a compaction. And again, you probably want to not let that go too high. Richard's been busy. He's added the recurse 2 variant to quad N info. We added recurse 1 to quad N info that says search here and downwards for files. And that's all very well until you get to the point where you have a directory where you don't have read access, at which point you promptly get, with recurse 1, a file access error and gets nothing back at all, which isn't very helpful. What we've done with 2, and I'll come on to a little demonstration of that in a minute, is that recurse 2 effectively skips unreadable directories and tells you what it can tell you. And the other thing we've done is that 11 and 12 quad N info have always been defined to be, tell me, they're booleans, is the current object readable or is it writable? In version 17, I think, nod Richard, in version 17, you can now trust the result of 11 quad N info. It used to just return -1. It now truly tells you whether the current name is readable or not. 12 quad N info always still returns -1 on Windows because there are different security models on Windows, and we can't guarantee that, we can't be certain that if we say it's readable, sorry, it's writable, that it truly is. So we still return -1, but it does tell you the correct result on other platforms. So here's a quick little demo. Let me stand over here. So I've started Dyalog APL. I've started it by calling sudo. I know that because although my real name is Andy's, my effective user ID is 0. Here's a fairly revolting piece of code which lists, I will pass it the name of a directory, and I need to check for both the name of the directory and the files under that directory. And that shows me that as with an effective user ID of root, so I can look at any file anywhere, I have these 6 files and directories, and all of them are readable and writable. I've then called 4001 IBEAM, which if you remember allows me to change my effective user ID, so I'm now Andy's, my user ID 6179. So now when I try to list Dyalog 19, I get 5 results, and the reason is because I come down to the directory called unreadable, and whereas here I am told in the original version that unreadable I have read permission, I don't have read permission anymore. Because I don't have read permission anymore, I can't even see that the file F2 exists. Okay? But at least I can get a listing of all the files and directories I can see under Dyalog 19, and I can check to see whether there are any unreadable directories. I can't do anything about it. That's your problem. That's your systems administrator's problem. But at least you can now check to see whether there are things there that you can't get to. Quick warning again, support for small span files was removed to write them in 17. If you try to write to a small span file in version 17, you get a file access error. Bjorn gets an apology from me at this point because I was cursing him something rotten because one of the systems we had started failing, and I thought he'd been up to no good with our customer relation management system. And the reason was that somewhere back in 2008, we created a file, which happened to be a small span file at the time, and ever since then we've been updating only one component in it. And then we upgraded Karen's PC, put 17 on it, and she promptly couldn't work with the system anymore. And we just saw the words file access error. And it took us a long time to work out that actually there was nothing wrong with the permissions whatsoever, either at the APL level or at the Unix level or anywhere. It only because I, tried to run it manually, I actually got the rest of the message, which was small span files are read-only. So, not one of our better error choice messages, but I think error message choices, but I think it's too late to change it now. And finally, Quad DMX. Richard has added the name of the file that causes, when you have an error in any of the native file handling stuff, Richard has included the name of the file in the extended error message. My bête noire, the thing I dislike most, is being presented with a message that says file name error, full stop. Good-o, what file? You have less reason to allow your users to make statements like that of you now, because you should know what the file name is, but we include it in here. I understand it would be more tricky to put it into the component file stuff just because of the way DMX works and the way component file handling works. However, a question for you. Don't want an answer now, but please could you have a mull over it. Where would you like us to concentrate our efforts on extending DMX messages? Where is it useful to you? Where do you think we can add information that makes your debugging easier? Example I have, again from just a few days ago, is I was getting a domain error when I tried to assign text to a clipboard object. And I'm sitting there thinking, well, I can't see what's wrong with that. It's a bunch of text. What do you mean domain error? John worked out the problem was that my clipboard was locked. And so what we're going to do is we're going to extend quad DMX for assigning to the text property of a clipboard, so that it will say domain error, the clipboard is locked. So where in Dyalog APL interpreter would you like us to concentrate our DMX messaging efforts? That's it. Any other comments, then please let me know or let us know, but otherwise, that's it.